Hello! Uh, Welcome to the video behind the link that you clicked. My capstone is about the colonization of the night sky, the IAU, and the stories left out of the night. I've gotten the comment throughout researching this project from multiple people that I hadn't thought of the night sky as something that could be colonized. But I think there's this narrative throughout history that if something has some significance to someone, then it can be taken away and redefined. The sky has always been part of human narrative. We see this through the prevalence of deities of the sky. But as far as star charts go and the constellations they've mapped, almost every civilization has had one. There are surviving charts from the Sumerians, recording on clay tablets, which you can see here, all the way over to the Norse with constellations that paralleled their religion. But the concept of standardizations, like the standardized 88 constellations that most people are familiar with, is an inherently colonist one. So I think the question is, why do we only have reliable records and steady knowledge of a standardized few? How did these 88 constellations become the standardized map of the night sky? What does the answer to the previous question tell us about the continuation of imperial power into a more modern age? Or at least, these are the questions that I tried my best to answer in my paper. Colonial power and the domineering effect that it has on both history and culture isn't new or foreign. I know many of my colleagues here in Goucher's history department have written papers pertaining to the topic, though I say that as if colonization isn't a hot topic throughout much of the academic world. Most of the research has been confined to the trappings of the Earth, then most colonizations find its roots on Earth. I think this introduction to the idea of the sky as something that can be colonized starts somewhere towards the end of the First World War. Arguably, the end dates for colonization are from about 1945, when the Second World War came to a close, to about the 1960s, when the majority of Asian Africa had gotten its independence from Europe. There is an argument that the fall of colonization was a much slower descent, one that started at the end of the First World War, when many previously colonial countries and colonies started first sparks of revolution. From the end of World War I, we also have the start of many international organizations, like the League of Nations, though later on we'll cover just how international some of these organizations are. The one that we are mainly going to focus on is the International Astronomical Union, or the IAU, that is responsible for the standardization of the constellations circa 1922. Though they formed in 1919, outlined the 88 current constellations during their third meeting in 1922, though it wasn't completely solidified and standardized until 1930. So what did the IAU leave out when they solidified the 88 constellations? Who got to decide what constellations warranted global renown, and just what got left out? This turns out to be much more than I initially complicated than I initially anticipated. It was also some of the most fun I've had researching in a while. To save time, we won't go into every star chart that I cover and discuss in my research. So the Belgian astronomer that is responsible for the current map of the 88, who worked in tandem with the IAU, was a man by the name of Eugene Delaporte. His final mapping, explained in his book Delimitation Scientifique des Constellations, took quite a bit of inspiration from other European astronomers. Two astronomers here whose star maps of the southern hemisphere are prominent in our current night sky stand out in Delaporte's work, along with the Hellenic constellations that Alexander the Great brought across continents during his conquest. Nicolas Louis de la Caille and Joseph Jerome Le Francis de Lalande were two Frenchmen who had contributed their own constellation maps in the 1500s. And aside from Felis the Cat, the Montefiore balloon, and several other constellations, most of what they proposed was ultimately used in the final 88. Though there is much to say of the fact that these French astronomers came into the southern hemisphere, a place not home to them, and arbitrarily just started mapping the night sky without any record of consulting the locals of these areas. Which leads again to this discussion of colonization of the stars, and introduces the concept prior to the more recent version that I'm discussing with our current star chart. Though, in combination, those few left out, and the constellations that did stay in, like Hologram, the pendulum clock, and Pictar, the artist's easel. Later, an American astronomer and professor, Herbert D. Curtis, said when he saw their map, it looks like somebody's attic. But moving on the top corner we have Felis the Cat from Lalonde's Night Sky saying a quick hello, along with the Montefiore balloon and the Harvest Keeper or the Vineyard Keeper, depending on your translation, the constellations that did not make it into the final night sky. But for an example of things that weren't even taken into consideration, and at least one example, the damaging effects that colonization has had, we're going to move away from Felis on to colonized night skies. Also, I say that they weren't taken into consideration, but there's no digitized records of the meetings that decided the constellations, so I should amend that statement to say there are no records of any other there are no records of any other culture of stars being taken into consideration when the IAU decided to make the standardized set of European constellations. So the Xinguan are the Chinese constellations. And on top of being broken into 4 quadrants, which you can see here on the right, there are about 318 individual constellations total. Overall, the records of these stars seem to be pretty well preserved, and there's a story pertaining to the placement of most of them and why they're in each specific quadrant. Now, the surviving 11 Norse constellations only survive because of an oral tradition. The 11 do have a direct tie into mythology, which is why they've probably preserved so far. But that same line, there's some discrepancy in the stars themselves, as well as with the mythology surrounding them. Though these seem to be the generally agreed upon set. However, then there's the opposite end of the spectrum of what has been recorded. We have the Hawaiian Constellations that coincide with their wayfinding traditions. There was a long stretch of time where the native people of the islands faced persecution if they practiced or even spoke their traditions, so as a result there's quite a bit that has been lost, though in recent years there has been a move to try and restore that history, and the Polynesian Voyaging Society has its archive of Hawaiian voyaging traditions that detail at least 34 constellations divided into 4 horizon maps that have been re-identified or recorded with local, logical conclusions that could have been used by their ancestors. Though, in one of the words of the men trying to recreate this lost night sky, a wayfinder uses many more stars than those listed in the 4 groups above. While many more stars are probably named and known in ancient Hawaii, their names have been lost. So, despite going through a very clipped speed run of most of my research, I believe that these are pretty solid examples for the depth of field that Delaporte had to work with when he initially started charting for the IAU. But our 88 constellations are still only drawn from really 3 sources: the Lalonde, De La Cal, and Hellenic night sky that Alexander the Great brought with him across his conquest. So why didn't he pull from any others? Perhaps the answer can be found in what constituted as international in 1919, when the IAU was founded. Unsurprisingly, when you look at the list of the countries who held membership in the first years of the IAU, both in the main division and in the research division, you find quite a few imperial and colonial powerhouses, or former colonies themselves. For instance, Belgium, Canada, Great Britain, France, Greece, Italy, Japan, Mexico, and the United States for the main division. And then those countries, in addition to Brazil, Australia, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Serbia, New Zealand, and South Africa, who were in the research division. Though to relate back to the point I made much earlier, mapping the night sky took place during a time of collapse. And the First World War marked the beginning of this collapse of colonialism, as the subsequent revolutions in previously colonized places, and the stark and shining example of the fall of the German and Russian imperialistic empires, marking a clear beginning of the end for some observing. These two previous empires lost large, tangible amounts of ground, and one can imagine that the overwhelming prospect of that happening again probably crossed a few world leaders' minds, and probably sparked this movement to claim the sky. I think it's also worth mentioning that only countries that paid dues to the Union could vote. For instance, Australia, Denmark, Norway, Brazil, Holland, Spain, Czechoslovakia, South Africa, Sweden, and Switzerland became full-fledged voting members of the IAU in 1925, specifically because they started paying dues. It seems like any country that could afford it could be a part of the Union, though that in itself is a big caveat there. Smaller countries still suffering from colonization, and countries like Germany suffering from the end of the World War had no way of paying dues. According to the IAU financial documents, countries would have, at the start, countries were asked to pay a sum based on their population size, with cuts at 5, 10, 15, and 20 million, which of course would have been a little bit more in 1922 and 1925 money because of inflation. And then there's the addition that the money that came into the Union was kept in the British pound and then transferred and legally assessed in French francs. So the power that IAU wielded within the scientific community was exponential then, and it's still intimidating now. Not only were they, and are, the current leading authority on astronomy, hence their power in declaring an autonomous star chart, but as previously explained, they commanded extensive global attendance. And though the term international in the 1920s seems to only include the richest countries from a few select colonial empires, are countries that were colonies themselves at some point under larger empires. Their power also expands into more recent times as well. For example, they are the organization that downgraded Pluto from planet status in 2006. Now, I am in no way saying that we should just chunk out the standardized set of colonizations that we have now. As of 2020, the map has been in use for about 99 years. Officially in use, I should say. But I think it's well worth noting that how it came to be, and that the people of cultures that were forgotten in favor of something that seems to me to be a grasp at power at the beginning of a gradual collapse of imperialism, not to mention a clinging to the old tendencies of colonization. I also think that there could be made an argument that this is something that should be taught in schools. Though speaking as someone who went through the American public school system, there's a great many things that should probably be taught in schools that aren't. I also seem to pin a lot of the blame of sky colonization on the IAU, like there's some sort of shady villain, which is really not the case. Honestly, this research topic and paper have a lot of room to grow, and I almost wish that I had the time and opportunity to expand it. But thank you so much for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.